Welcome to the first of 5 videos on linear regression. General concepts. What is regression? Regression is a statistical study of a connection between two variables. Here's an example. Suppose we wanted to look at a connection between the number of hours people studied and the score they received on a test. And suppose these 9 dots in this so-called scatter plot represented actual people who studied a certain amount and got a certain score, as indicated by the graph. Regression might ask the question, is there some predictability or pattern that we see here? Now, these particular data points, these 9 individuals who took this test, their scores appear to line up in an almost linear fashion. And linear regression is the study between how well two variables line up and what kinds of predictions we can make with that. When we study linear regression in this 5-video series, we'll be able to answer questions like, how can we describe the correlation between the two variables? Or we can answer specific questions like, if we had a person who expected to study 6 hours, what might they score? We can also answer questions like, how much does each additional hour of study increase your grade? Or, what percentage of the variation in test scores is attributable to studying as opposed to other factors that might influence somebody's test score? And we'll be able to answer questions like, is the correlation that we find between these two variables statistically significant enough to point out that it's worth noting? By the way, not all patterns that we study in the world necessarily follow a almost straight line. Here's an example of something that appears a little less linear. The data points on this scatter plot are individuals between the age of 6 and 16, indicating how much they can lift in kilograms. And this pattern has more of a curve or a general curvature to the data than the previous one did. Now, not all things that we study in life are necessarily linear. In fact, many of them aren't. This may be one of them. This video series doesn't cover other kinds of regression that involve curvatures. There's quadratic regression, exponential regression, logarithmic regression, and there's lots of things that you can do in more advanced venues. Linear regression is the most basic, and that's what this 5-video series is about. Sometimes we find something that has almost no predictable pattern or what we'll later call correlation at all. This is an example of individuals, and we've plotted their IQ scores and their average daily sodium intake in milligrams. Well, it's kind of all over the map here, and there's no predictable pattern, and we wouldn't expect to find a correlation necessarily in something that's so spread apart in its scatter plot. So we've looked at general concepts. Our next video is just about entering data into calculators. If you've already learned that, you may want to skip video 2. After that, we'll talk about correlation, because correlation isn't something that we just see by looking at the dots. Correlation is something we can actually measure in a numerical sense. In our 4th video, we'll learn how to find what's called a regression line, which is a mathematical formula that makes predictions between the variables. And in our last video, hypothesis testing, we'll be able to answer questions like, is the correlation that we found between two variables statistically significant, or isn't it? And that completes the first video.